Today, we're doing something very exciting. We are going to be coding with ChatGPT. I'm pretty sure if you're watching this video, you already know what ChatGPT is, but on the off chance that you don't use social media and you haven't been overwhelmed by many lofty claims about what AI can do, let me explain what ChatGPT is. It is a large language model that is basically trained on tons and tons and tons of data available on the internet. So everything we've been uploading for the past 2 decades or so. And it's able to, from those large data sets, piece together the best responses to questions it is asked in a human language format. So it's like having a conversation with a computer, basically. Today, we're going to be leveraging ChatGPT's capabilities to write our code. The first thing I want to do is to ask ChatGPT to create my code for me. We're going to be assigning room numbers in our model, and I want it to be, for the sake of example, 5 rooms in the model, and I want ChatGPT to write me a code that will actually assign all of the numbers in the format that I want. And to make sure that we are going to test this correctly, I recommend creating a Revit model, a test model that you own, and creating a model with 5 rooms and no numbers assigned. I mean, there will be numbers assigned, which are the default Revit numbers, but none of the numbers should be assigned by you. Once you have that done, let's get started and let's see how good ChatGPT is actually at coding. Okay, so my prompt today is create a C# Revit script that can set the parameter of room numbers using a list of numbers. Now you notice I didn't just say create a C# script that can assign room numbers, because with AI, specificity improves your results. The more specific your prompts are, the better your chances of getting the exact result that you want. So now I'm speaking like a programmer. I'm saying create a C# script that can set the parameter of the room, because I know that that's exactly what I want to do, is to set a new parameter, and using a list of numbers, because the data type that can store a series of integers, numbers, in Revit is a list. So I've told it exactly how I want the code to work. So let's press enter and see what happens. Okay, so firstly, we have all our using statements correctly. We have our namespace, which we will have to change to our first Revit plugin, which is the same thing we've been doing for all our previous codes. We have the class name, which we have to make sure that the class name in Visual Studio matches this. That's pretty much it. So here we have our list of the numbers I want to set, our filtered element collector to retrieve all the rooms in the document, a loop to actually set the parameter, which we'll be looking at later. So we're going to be looking at the code step by step later on to actually learn what each part of it is doing. But let's just, for now, copy paste this into Visual Studio and see what happens. So I'm back in our first Revit plugin Visual Studio solution. The first thing we want to do is create a new class. So I'm just going to right click on our first Revit plugin and go to add, go to new item, and select a class. I'm not going to rename this class for now, just because I want the name of the class to be exactly the same as the name of the class that ChatGPT made. So for now, we're just going to have it as the default name, which should be class1.cs, and I'll just say add. Back in ChatGPT, you'll see this icon on the top right that says copy code. We want to basically just copy everything. Now, we'll have to fix this code to actually work for us, but it has all our using statements. It has the namespace, it has the transaction. Everything we need is here. So we're just copying the whole thing, going back into Visual Studio. And I'm literally going to select everything so that it replaces all the things we have. Notice that right now, because we made this class on our own, the namespace is actually our first Revit plugin. We're going to have to replace this in the ChatGPT code once we paste it. Okay, so our code is all here. I don't see any red, meaning there's no errors. We have our list of 5 rooms that we want to assign. We have our transaction mode. The only thing we want to fix here is the namespace, which should be our first Revit plugin, as that is where our code is located. Make sure it's case sensitive and just accept the suggestion so you don't have to keep typing. And also change the class name so that the name of the class inside the code matches the name of the actual class that will be compiled later on. So instead of class 1, we want to right click, say rename, and call it the same thing we have here, which is set room numbers command. Obviously, we could change the name in the code as well, but for now, let's just stick with what we got from ChatGPT. Okay, do a double check just to make sure that the name of your class is exactly the same as the name in the code, because that's the best way to make sure there are no errors. And we'll set it to copy if newer, so that our code is always exported to our output directory once we have completed the solution. Okay, great. As usual, we're going to go into our manifest file to create the manifest file for the set room numbers command. So clicking on hello world.addin. In our last video, we made the walls collector add-in. So in this video, we're going to do the same thing we did before, which is to comment it out. You can leave it if you wish, but what will happen is when you launch Revit, all of the add-ins you've made will have to be loaded. For the sake of time, I'm just going to comment it out so that we only have the code we're working with today. So that's Control K and Control C, and that's commented out. Then I'm going to just copy everything in between the add-in tabs so that I can create a new manifest file for our room number command. Okay, so we have everything we need. Now all we have to do is change the full class name. So it's set room numbers command. You could copy and paste this or you could type it out. The next thing we want to do, just for the sake of keeping this tidy, is to change the text associated with our add-in from walls collector to set room numbers. Everything else is okay, except of course for our GUID, which we always need to have an original GUID so that Revit is not confused as to which add-in it's running. So we go into tools, create GUID from tools, select new GUID, copy, and paste. Remove everything extra because we don't need that right now. And we are actually good to go, guys. Just do one last check for housekeeping reasons. Set room numbers command is correct. Our namespace is correct. Our adding is ready. So the last thing we want to do is make sure you have a file in Revit that actually has 5 rooms, because that's what we're working with today. And let's get started in testing this out. So you press start to begin debugging. It's going to launch Revit because we already set it up in the previous video. If you don't know how to do that, please watch my previous video on how to set up Visual Studio and how to set up your coding environment so that whenever you debug, it launches the application. All right, guys, here is our adding set room numbers. So we're going to load once. So here I've already gone ahead to create a project with 5 rooms and it's numbered 1 to 5. But in architectural conventions, this is usually not accurate. It's usually in the 100 series. So it will be 101, 102, 103, and so on. I'm going to leave this as is just so that we can see if our add-in will actually change the numbers. So this is the moment of truth, guys. Can we actually make a code with ChatGPT that will actually solve our problem with no edits whatsoever, except just fixing the add-in manifest file and changing the namespace? Let's see what happens. So I go to the add-ins tab and I click on external tools, and there's my command. I'm going to run it and fingers crossed that it works. And there we have it, guys. It actually worked with no edits whatsoever and just ChatGPT code. I've been able to change the room numbers in my project. Isn't that amazing? So at this point, if you have gotten this far, please let me know if it worked for you. The thing about AI is that the results are not consistent. So even if you use exactly the same prompt as I did, there's a very strong chance that your code may not work exactly as it did for me. I'm really curious to see if it worked for you. So just leave a comment that says it worked. If you tried this out and got to this point and it actually worked for you. For those of you who really just were interested in seeing if ChatGPT can code, well, you can see it can and you can log off at this point. But for those of you who want to actually see how the code works and why it was able to work, we're going to go back into Visual Studio and look at what we got from ChatGPT and actually examine it step by step. Okay, so I'm all zoomed in so we can actually see the code we got from AI. Firstly, we have our namespaces, which is something we always need. We have our first Revit plugin. We have our transaction attributes. We have our class name. We have our external command data and our UI document and document. If you are not sure of what all of these things mean and why we need them, please watch the videos that I posted earlier in my coding series as I explain every part of this in detail. Now let's get to the actual code about room numbers. First thing we have is a list of strings. Now, the room numbers, even though they are numbers, they can actually be set using the string data type. So that's the first thing we've created here is a new list, call it room numbers, and set it to new list of strings. And because we specifically asked the AI for 5 rooms, it gave us 5 room numbers. Now, I didn't tell AI that I wanted it in this series of 101, 102, 103, 104. But because I used a version of ChatGPT that has me previously asking it for architectural related information, it knows that I'm probably an architect and this is most likely the kind of information that I want. So that's the first thing. I'm curious to know if it actually gave you these numbers or if it just gave you 1 to 5. Please let me know in the comments. The next thing here is our filtered element collector, which is cast into an iList. An iList is an interface of list. In my beginner series, I explained the difference between a regular data type and an interface. So an iList data type collects all the rooms using a filtered element collector, which we learned about 2 videos ago on this channel. Now, this is where we start to encounter things we probably haven't seen for the first time. We have an if statement here, which tells us if the rooms count is not equal to the room numbers count, which means if I don't have just 5 rooms in my model, if I have more than 5 rooms, right now room numbers is set to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If for some reason I had 8 rooms in my model rather than 5, it should just return a message that says the number of rooms and the number of room numbers provided do not match. Return result dot failed. This is known as error handling in coding, where we are trying to predict scenarios where maybe the code doesn't match the model and we don't want it to just crash. We want it to just tell the user, actually, you have more rooms than we have in our code, so it's not going to work. And then we have a using statement, which is hosting a transaction. Now, this is a transaction class different from the transaction attribute that we used at the beginning. I'm going to be explaining the difference between the two of them towards the end of the video. The transaction class is requiring the document, which we already got, and a name, which is set room numbers. We always have to start the transaction to actually make changes to the model. And here we have a for loop, which is going through each and every one of the rooms in the model. And if there is a room there, which means if room is not equals to null, then basically get the parameter that's already there and then set it. Now we're going to go through this step by step because of everything in this code. I think this is the only part that we haven't seen before. So first of all, let's learn about the transaction class and how it's different from the transaction attribute. A transaction class in Revit is a set of operations that make changes to the model. Without a transaction, you can't actually make a change to a Revit model. You can get data from the model, like you can use a filtered element collector and just return, let's say, how many walls are in the project. But to actually change things like what we've done right now, changing the room number from one to another, you actually need a transaction. So you need to always create one instance of the transaction, and you can either start, commit, or roll back the transaction. Start is a method that begins the transaction. Commit will make the changes to the model. So once the transaction has been committed, you will have to undo to actually remove the transaction. So if you think about any of the commands that you actually perform in Revit, those are transactions. And that's why every time you've made a transaction and it's committed, in order to roll back, you need to use the undo command. Now, this is the syntax for the transaction class. You declare it as a variable like all the other C# variables. You use a new keyword because it's been instantiated for the first time. It requires the document and the transaction name, which is a string. We've already seen this in our code. And inside of this, you need to start, commit, and or roll back your transaction. The transaction attribute, on the other hand, which we learned about when we were creating a collector, is used to define the entire behavior of the Revit add-in. So the attribute will tell it how we want it to modify the model. Like, it's basically telling the whole add-in how to behave, and the transaction class is telling a specific part of the code how we want it to work when we run the add-in. I know it's a bit tricky, but basically the transaction attribute is added usually before you declare your external command, and it tells Revit that we want this add-in to be manual, which means we want to have to click on it first before it works. Read only, which means we are not getting anything changed in this code. We just wanted to maybe extract the data in this active Revit document and put this data somewhere else. And automatic means as soon as we launch Revit, we don't want to click on anything. We just want this to run. We usually avoid using automatic because you don't know if your code has any issues, and so you just don't want it running without clicking on it. So it's always usually manual or read-only you find people using with Revit add-ins. The attribute is declared at the beginning of the code and tells the whole code how you want it to run. And the class is declared inside of the code and telling a specific set of operations exactly how you want those to run. So that explains the transaction part of our code, but why is it inside a using statement? Why didn't we just declare it as a transaction? So typically, because transactions will actually make a change to your model, you always want to wrap it in either a using or a try catch statement, which means you always want it to only run if certain conditions are met. Otherwise, because it's making changes to your model, if for some reason your model doesn't match the requirements you specified in your code, it's going to run anyway and probably cause issues in your model. And so you would usually find your transaction wrapped in either a try catch statement like we have here, or inside a using statement like we have inside our code. The next interesting thing here is the for loop, where we have for int I equals 0, I is less than rooms or count, and I plus plus. So what does that even mean, right? Well, this is the syntax of the for loop. I've already done a video on what loops are and how they work in my beginner series, but let me just explain in detail what this actually means for those who are maybe struggling a little with understanding loops. Loops in programming are how you perform continuous operations. So non-continuous operations is you want something to just happen once and that's it. A loop goes through a series of different elements in the model and makes changes to those elements. So for example, changing every single room in the model is a loop because it has to go from the first one to the next one and the next one and the next one. If we only had one room and we just wanted to change that one room, we probably don't need a loop. But because we have several, and in most cases, you don't know how many you intend to have, you just want to code something that will run through every single iteration until the command and the action is completed. So let's start from the int, which is the data type, I equals to 0. This sets your loop counter to 0. I, in this case, is a new variable. So anytime you see for int I is a new variable. You could literally call it anything. It could be for int Victoria equals 0. As long as I continue to use this same variable throughout the code, it will work in exactly the same way. But the convention is usually to use something like I. So I is a new variable, sets the loop counter to 0, which means let's start with I at 0. So in this case, I is 0. Where I is less than x, x being a variable that will control how many rooms we have, and I plus plus, which means after you go through I is 0, add 1 to it. So for I is 0, let I be less than the number of rooms. And then increment I. So for I is 1, let I be less than number of rooms. Increment I again. For I is 2. So anytime you see plus plus, it means run the loop starting at 0. This is the condition we're checking for. And then continue adding one digit, one value to 0 until you reach the end of the code. I hope that clears it up a little. But with loops, it takes a while and a bit of use and experimentation to really wrap your head around how they work. But basically, we're setting it up so that it keeps continuously iterating through the model until everything we want is achieved. Here we have for int I is 0, so start I as 0. Where I is less than the number of rooms, dot count will give you the number of rooms in the model. This is a method that will access just basically how many rooms you have. Incrementally add 1 to I and check so long as it's less than the entire number of rooms, let this part of the code work. So that is what controls this portion of the code, which is an if statement. Now, I already went through what an if statement is in my beginner series, but just for the sake of explanation, an if statement basically just says if something is true, then this is what I want you to do. So if Victoria is a great teacher, subscribe. This is a great time to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I hope you've been enjoying the videos so far and learning so much about coding. It supports me a lot when you subscribe, so please do, and don't forget to like and share the video as well. And there is our code. We have our 4 statements, 2 if statements. We have our transaction start, which means start running this transaction, and commit, apply the changes to the model. We don't have a rollback in this case because we've already created an if message to tell us that if there's something wrong with how we've created our rooms, just return result.failed. Then we've encapsulated the rest of the transaction in a using statement. We're going to look more deeply into loops and how they work because this is a bit more complex. We're also going to investigate getting and setting parameters, which is something we've done very easily using ChatGPT today. So I'm hoping I see you in the next video so that we can actually start to learn how to code without the assistance of AI. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.